Nicole couldn't come over tonight, Kim said. All of her married brothers and sisters showed up, and she felt she better stay home. I guess they get together every Sunday evening. Typical Mormon behavior, Frank said under his breath. Welcome back to WordWise. I'm your host, Kit, and I spent nearly the entire month of April in bed. I had the flu, and then bronchitis, and then asthma, and now I have bronchitis again. That's why these videos aren't coming out as quickly as I hoped they would. As with my last video, you'll have to forgive my gravelly voice. We're just gonna hope that I can keep talking for 2 hours. Today we're going to discuss Chad Daybell's 4th novel, Chasing Paradise. When I opened Chasing Paradise for the first time, I was shocked to discover that it was signed by Chad Daybell. I felt really weird about it. Frankly, I would have paid a couple dollars more for a copy that wasn't signed by him. Like, the eBay listing should have warned me. This book inhabits a curious place in the timeline of Chad's life as a writer. This is the last novel he let someone else publish for him, and it was because of the fallout from this story's publication that he ended up opening his own publishing company, which I really think changed the direction of his writing and opened up possibilities for things he could put in his stories that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. Chad wrote a total of 13 novels, including 3 series and 1 standalone novel. Technically, all of these take place in the same universe, which I've decided to call the Chad Daybell Doomsday Universe, or CDDU. This book is unique in that it isn't part of a series, although Doug's girlfriend Becky does make a cameo. The Dalton and North families from the Emma trilogy, and Kim and Josh Brown from this book are the focus of the Standing in Holy Places series. So while this story isn't part of a series, the characters it introduces will be part of the next series. I made this diagram to try to help clarify all of this. So now that we know where we are in the CDDU, let's jump right in, because the more I looked into this book, the more I found worth talking about. It's going to be a long one. The book opens with an author's note from Chad, in which he talks about near-death experiences. Interestingly, he doesn't make any mention of his own, and I believe this is because he never had one, and didn't start claiming to have had one, 2, actually, until long after this book was printed in 2003. Here's what he says. This is a work of fiction, but it is based on true experiences. The descriptions of the spirit world, and even the actions of various spirits, are based on actual accounts of those who have had near-death experiences. Each near-death experience is unique. Some people found themselves in paradise when they crossed over, while others arrived in spirit prison. But a general thread of truth runs through them all. I based the book on experiences found in many publications, but I found the following books to be the most helpful in giving a portrayal of the spirit world. Then he lists 9 books he ripped off when writing this. I've never seen any author be so blatant about idea stealing. I actually read all of them, and they're almost entirely Mormon near-death experience memoirs. I quite enjoyed I Saw Heaven, which is a real roller coaster, but Return from Tomorrow is by far the best. I'm going to talk about it a lot. The story itself begins with a section titled An Important Message. This is a letter from a man named Guy Calvert, explaining that the manuscript for this book magically appeared in his office one day, and he and his wife undertook to publish it because they felt it was an important story. This is the second time Chad has mentioned that a story people believe or know to be true is being published as fiction. He described An Errand for Emma the same way, saying that it was a story that Emma had written that was published as fiction, even though it was true. And I think that's an indication of Chad's semi-secret belief that his true predictions were being published as fiction. I also think there's some hidden psychology here regarding the name Guy. Chad's middle name is Guy, and I wonder if he named this character after himself because he feels like Guy Calvert does what Chad believed he was doing, acting as a sort of conduit through which divine texts can enter the world. Chapter 1 begins the actual story. This is Chad's first novel written in third-person point of view, and his writing is worse for it. Third-person point of view is writing, she did this, he did that, they went to the market. Writing in third person is harder for most people than writing in first person, because writing in third person requires balancing the character's perspective with the narrator's perspective. If you're writing in first person, the reader assumes that everything is written in the main character's voice, and that tends to make the characters feel more developed and fleshed out. If you're writing in third person, 90% of the text is actually the narrator's voice, and you have to compensate with additional characterization. Unfortunately for Chad, he already has trouble with characterization, and writing in third person only makes his inability to give his characters' personalities more apparent. So let's begin. As usual, there's a lot to say about Chad's opening. The elegant two-story building once again caught Tina Marlar's eye as she and her older sister Kim walked past it for the third time. Crowds of people were eagerly going inside, but Tina had no desire to get spooked. "Come on, Tina," Kim said. "You're 15 years old. How can you come to Disneyland and not go in the Haunted Mansion?" Tina shrugged. "You know how I feel. I get scared even watching Halloween cartoons. I'm sure that ride will give me nightmares." Things Chad does right. He identifies the main characters. He establishes their relationship and Tina's age. He specifies the setting, although he doesn't really describe it. I think that placing the opening at the Haunted Mansion is actually a not terrible way of introducing the idea of the paranormal, and it creates an opportunity for Tina to reflect on the afterlife, which she sort of does. Things Chad does wrong. Now that he's in third person instead of first, he's going to start info dumping in dialogue, which in my opinion is one of the high crimes of literature. Anytime a character says, "You know that," and then gives biographical information, that is a red flag. The information about Tina's age could easily have been included in the narration instead of the dialogue, and we could have learned from Tina's reactions in the scene that she's afraid of spooky things. They didn't really have to have a conversation about it beforehand. Kim convinces Tina to go into the Haunted Mansion, and Tina is surprised when she doesn't actually find it very scary. Afterward, the girls have a conversation that foreshadows the rest of the book. Tina looked up. "Do you really think there are spirits all around us?" "I don't think so," Kim said with a smile. "Did it frighten you that badly?" Tina nodded. "A little. I'll be fine, but if that ride is anything like what happens to us when we die, I want to live forever." This is a major milestone in the development of Chad's writing. He's never foreshadowed anything before. It's not super well done, but it's done, and that's something. Unfortunately, as an inciting incident and an opening hook, it leaves much to be desired. A teenage girl overcoming her fear of a Disney ride isn't all that intriguing, especially not to adults, and this was written for an adult audience. The girls meet up with their parents, Frank and Carmen. Frank is in the Air Force, and his family was recently relocated to Utah. They leave Disneyland, spend the night in Vegas, and then drive home in the morning. Thus ends chapter 1. The Marlar family arrives home in Layton, Utah. Kim invites her friend Nicole over for dinner, but Nicole can't make it. Kim explains why to her family. "Nicole couldn't come over tonight," Kim said. "All of her married brothers and sisters showed up, and she felt she better stay home. I guess they all get together every Sunday evening." "Typical Mormon behavior," Frank said under his breath. This is the scene where we find out that Frank hates Mormons. There's an obvious problem with the scene, though. Chad can't bring himself to ever write a Mormon character who does anything wrong, so Frank's hatred comes off as ridiculous. He's criticizing Nicole for spending time with her family. Why would he look down on her for that? And the most ridiculous part is he's criticizing her for it while having dinner with his own family. I think there's some of Chad's paranoia embedded here, his belief that Mormons are constantly being persecuted by others. Frank discovers that Nicole has offered to let Kim read her Book of Mormon, and he quits dinner and slams the kitchen door, prompting Carmen to say, "Everything will be okay," she said. "Your father is a wonderful man, except when it comes to the Mormons." Sure, your dad's a great guy, except for his irrational religious bigotry. Carmen tells Kim not to bring Nicole around for a while. Kim and Tina have only been at their new school for a month, and Tina hasn't made any friends, but now she's too afraid to talk to other students because she's scared they'll turn out to be Mormons and her father will be angry. Kim and Tina attend a high school football game with Nicole. Tina is surprised when a boy named Roger sits next to her, and they chat briefly about how Roger is failing geometry. After he leaves, Nicole tells Tina and Kim that Roger used to go to church with her, but he hasn't been for a couple of years. Tina has a crush on Roger and his spiky blonde hair, because she doesn't realize he might as well have horns. And the chapter ends with the two of them making eyes at each other across the bleachers. A few days later, Roger asks Tina if she can tutor him in geometry, and they meet at the library that evening and do a little studying. Roger invites Tina to come hang out with him and his friends in an underground mall parking lot, but she declines because he doesn't want Kim and Nicole to come along, which does seem suspicious. Roger leaves and Tina starts walking home. After a few blocks, she turned onto a side street and waited at the corner for a car to pass through the intersection. Suddenly, the car lurched at her as the driver tried to reach for something in the back seat. The car's front bumper clipped Tina's right leg, and she was thrown onto the car's hood. She hit the windshield, then tumbled off, bouncing 3 times before landing painfully on her shoulder in the gutter. Her purse and books landed a few feet away. I'll spare you the description of her injuries, which is actually quite gory. I just want to point out that Chad has once again described human bodies as bouncing. I finally looked into this, and the human body can sort of bounce once if it falls from a great height, almost always high enough to kill a person. It just doesn't work the way Chad wants it to, and the talk here is kind of cartoonish. I was reading one of the books Chad listed as having informed his depiction of the spirit world, and I found this account in a chapter of a book called Beyond the Veil, Volume 1. In Chapter 18, which is titled Impossible Things Just Take Longer, Nettie Pritchard describes her near-death experience. The car had hit me in the left leg just below the hip, flipping me onto the hood, and then, as it came to a stop, pitching me forward a few feet. Doesn't that sound remarkably, suspiciously like Tina's accident? I think Chad stole it directly from Mrs. Pritchard. Then he writes this. The pain was intense. Then Tina heard a distinct buzzing sound, seemingly coming from inside her body. She heard a faint pop, and the pain was gone. She sat up and felt more at peace than she had in a long time. Wow, that was weird, Tina said. She wasn't bleeding now, and her thigh bone had somehow snapped back into place. She resumed walking toward her home. This is a description of Tina dying, in case you couldn't tell. Chad believes that when we die, we hear an internal buzzing sound, and then a pop, and that's it. I'm not sure what the buzzing sound is supposed to be, but I did find where he stole it. This is from Chapter 9, Half In, Half Out, an account by Janet M., in Beyond the Veil, Volume 4. At this point, she's in the ER, and I believe she's having a baby. It says, about then I heard this buzz starting in my head. Just a buzz. There's no real explanation of it here either. I just think it's interesting that Chad appears to have stolen it. Chad gives us such a weird description of Tina's death, and I think it's notable for its failure to produce any emotional reaction. There's no feeling associated with this experience, just physical sensations. Tina doesn't even realize what's happened. And the more I read the scene, the more it bothers me. This is the death of a 15-year-old, and there's no poignancy, no sadness even. Dr. Matthias talks about Chad's profound fear of death, and one of the biggest themes in the Standing in Holy Places series is the minimization of death. Tina's only a couple of years younger than Tylee was. Did Chad mentally justify what he allegedly did to her by telling himself that this is what death is like? It's just a buzzing sound and a pop. It's not really that big a deal. Was he as unemotional about Tylee's death as he is about Tina's? I'll tell you, when the prosecution was showing photos of Tylee's remains in court, the ones that made jurors cry, Chad's eyes were riveted to the projector screen. It was unsettling. Tina runs into a man wearing old-fashioned clothes, who tells her that she left something behind, and when she turns back, she sees her own body lying in the gutter. It bounced 3 times, but couldn't make it over that curb. I'm not sure why, but Chad felt the need to specify that her body is in the gutter over and over. Even Tina references it. Mom, Dad, my body's in the gutter. He really wants to drive this point home. Thus ends chapter 3. He really wants to drive this point home. Thus ends chapter 3. Tina examines her body, and we get a continuation of Chad's complete indifference toward human life. Tina stared down at her broken, blood-covered body. Once she realized it was her body, she was surprised at her lack of concern. She now realized her body was just a shell, covering her real identity like a glove. But listen to what does get a reaction. The accident had partially torn open her body's shirt and showed her stomach. Tina reached down to cover herself, but her hand passed right through the clothing. She tried again and again to pull down the shirt, but she couldn't grip it. She couldn't even feel the cloth. Now this section gets 2 exclamation points, but the paragraph where she looks at her body doesn't get any. So human life means nothing, death means nothing, but modesty and appearances remain vitally important. I hate that. The old man ghost has followed Tina back to the curb. The old man was watching her, and he let out a loud laugh. It looks like you're in big trouble. Don't blame me, she said defensively. This is Roger's fault. If he'd stayed with me longer at the library, this wouldn't have happened. Does Tina misunderstand the old man? It sounded to me like he was saying that she's in a difficult situation. I find it curious that Tina assumes that he means she's in trouble with someone, some authority figure. Her claim that this is Roger's fault is just stupid. Misplaced blame is such a common plot device in bad stories. I want to talk about it for a minute. Misplaced blame and misunderstandings are fundamentally lazy writing, and they're rooted in poor characterization. Conflict between characters needs to emerge from natural personality differences and poor decision making, and flat characters don't have the complexity to make bad choices, unless they only make bad choices. Characters who are good people can still hurt each other through their actions. They can make bad decisions. They can say mean, ugly things to each other and still be good people and still be the hero of the story. But in Chad's stories, people are either good or evil, or they occasionally flip-flop for no apparent reason. That's not how people work. There aren't good people and bad people. Even Chad himself, although he has done terrible things and I hope he spends the rest of his life in prison, probably has good qualities. I assume. My point is, people are complex and multifaceted, and a good conflict between characters will emerge naturally from their differences. Misplaced blame and misunderstandings, however, result from a writer's refusal to let their heroes and heroines do bad things to each other. In the case of this novel, the blame for Tina's accident quite obviously falls on the driver of the car. But Chad wants to emphasize that Roger is a bad person, so Tina blames him, even though he had nothing to do with this accident. Which leads to an obvious question. Why didn't Chad just have Roger hit Tina with his car instead of this random stranger? That would have made much more sense. I don't know why he didn't do it, but he didn't. Instead, Tina blames Roger without any logical reason. And as soon as she thinks of Roger, she accidentally teleports to join him in the parking lot under the mall. She flew above houses and trees and found herself descending into the Layton Hills Mall parking lot. She came to rest within 5 feet of Roger, who was sitting on the hood of his car, laughing with his buddies. Tina was stunned to see he had a beer in his hand. My God. Who would have guessed, based on Roger's beautifully spiked hair, that he would turn out to be evil? She discovers that a handful of other spirits have surrounded Roger and his friends and are taking turns inhabiting their bodies. This belief that being intoxicated can allow evil spirits to possess the living appears in a number of other Mormon doomsday near-death experience memoirs. There's an especially visceral and, frankly, somewhat suggestive version in Visions of Glory, a book whose author is almost as morally skewed as Chad. But the earliest appearance of this book that I've found comes from a book called Return from Tomorrow, which is another NDE memoir Chad read. It is by far the best NDE memoir I've read, and Chad stole quite a few elements from it. All of the living people we were watching were surrounded by a faint luminous glow, almost like an electrical field over the surface of their bodies. This luminosity moved as they moved, like a second skin made out of pale, scarcely visible light. I love that description. Here's Chad's version. She also noticed that the young men had golden outlines around their bodies, as if someone had traced around them with yellow crayon. Meanwhile, the prowling spirits had no such aura, and as she stretched out her arm, Tina noticed she didn't have one either. There's an obvious difference here in the quality of description. Here's Return from Tomorrow's description of spirit possession. I was staring in amazement as the bright cocoon around the unconscious sailor simply opened up. It parted at the very crown of his head and began peeling away from his head, his shoulders. Instantly, quicker than I had ever seen anyone move, one of the insubstantial beings who had been standing near him at the bar was on top of him. He had been hovering like a thirsty shadow at the sailor's side, greedily following every swallow the young man made. Now he seemed to spring at him like a beast of prey. I love this bit, thirsty shadow. That's beautiful. Here's a less beautiful version. Tina only recognized one of Roger's friends, Bart Dotson, from school. The other two guys seemed older. Bart had 5 empty beer bottles at his feet, and he slowly chugged down a 6th one. Bart staggered slightly, and the prowling spirits closed around him, elbowing each other and fighting like dogs. Bart finally collapsed to the ground, and Tina watched in amazement as his golden aura split open at the crown of his head. The lurking spirits briefly fought even more fiercely. Then 2 of them leaped into the opening of Bart's aura. They had entered Bart's body! The spirits around Tina fight with each other over who gets to possess the drunk guy next. But there's also a female spirit who's just trying to get her nicotine fix. A female spirit had joined the group. Roger had lit a cigarette, and this woman stood right in front of him, trying to grab the cigarette out of his hand. When Roger took a puff, the woman tried to get it into her mouth, too. When Roger blew the smoke out, the woman tried to surround herself in it and breathe it all in. Of course, she didn't have lungs, so the smoke just drifted away. The woman muttered, "Oh, just one more puff. That's all I want." Chad stole this from Return to Tomorrow as well. I saw a group of assembly line workers gathered around a coffee canteen. One of the women asked another for a cigarette, begged her in fact, as though she wanted it more than anything in the world. But the other one, chatting with her friends, ignored her. She took a pack of cigarettes from her coveralls, and without even offering one to the woman who reached for it so eagerly, took one out and lit it. Fast as a striking snake, the woman who had been refused snatched at the lit cigarette in the other one's mouth. Again she grabbed at it, and again. With a little chill of recognition, I saw that she was unable to grip it. Naturally, Chad's version is less sophisticated and more ridiculous, especially the dialogue. Tina is witnessing all of this. Tina was sickened. She had misjudged Roger. She couldn't believe this was the same guy she had studied with earlier that evening. So Roger has 1 beer and 1 cigarette, and this actually sickens Tina. She thinks she's misjudged him as a person. The idea that a person can be both a student who wants to pass geometry and a casual drinker and smoker is incomprehensible to Tina. We're again seeing Chad's inability to acknowledge the complexity of people here. Having a beer and a cigarette after finishing your homework isn't an ideal way to relax, especially if you're a teenager. I would even go so far as to say it demonstrates poor judgment, but it's hardly immoral. Tina then wishes herself home and magically teleports there. She finds her sister doing her homework and manages to send a shiver down Kim's spine. Then Chad makes a classic error. He jumps to Kim's point of view for the last 3 paragraphs of the chapter. It comes out of nowhere. A siren approached their neighborhood, and Kim hoped it wasn't for anyone she knew. Now, you can write in third-person omniscient, which is the point of view where an all-knowing narrator can inhabit the viewpoint of any character in a scene. It is a tricky point of view to write well, and I wouldn't recommend it for beginners because it's so hard. I find it really intimidating, and I've written a lot. The hardest part, really, is balancing the points of view. You don't necessarily want to have a situation where you feel like you have to devote equal time in narration to each point of view. But what you do need to do is sort of establish a pattern early on so that your reader either knows what to expect or at the very least isn't surprised when we're suddenly in someone else's point of view. This is just jarring. If you're going to write in third-person omniscient, you need to establish a pattern of point of view alterations and stick to it. Chad doesn't do that, and it's going to throw the reader. The police then arrive at the Marlar house with a message for Tina's parents. Thus ends chapter 4. By my estimation, less than 10 minutes have passed since Tina was hit by this car. But in that time, someone has called 911, paramedics and police have arrived, Tina has been identified, and her family has been located and notified. That is not realistic. Nor is it realistic that the police lead the Marlars to Tina's body, which is still lying in the gutter. As Tina's family reached the crowd, Carmen tried to hold Tina's body. Frank had to hold her back despite her screams. 2 paramedics were doing all they could to revive Tina, but so far there hadn't been any signs of life. The last thing the police want to do is bring an upset family to a crime scene. They would have told Tina's parents to meet them at the hospital. Instead, Tina and her mother ride along with Tina's physical body in the ambulance, along with a paramedic. I found this paragraph odd. Tina sat beside him and looked at her body. She saw the bloody face and shattered leg and felt repulsed. She had spent 15 years in that body, but now she didn't want anything to do with it. It seems like she would have some reverence, or appreciation, or even fondness for the body she spent 15 years in, but instead she's disgusted. Chad's not wrong that compound fractures can be pretty hard to look at, but this body is the only vessel through which Tina can be with her family. You'd expect her to be jumping back into it at the first opportunity. Everyone arrives at the ER, and the doctors manage to briefly revive Tina. Okay. Then Tina heard a low rushing sound that seemed to sweep her up, and instantly she found herself back in her body. "Oh, the pain!" she cried out. Every part of her body felt covered in burning embers. "She's back!" one of the doctors shouted, and Tina heard the steady beeping of a heart monitor. Tina moaned and looked for her sister. Their eyes met. Kim rushed out of the corner and took Tina's hand. "Hold on, little sister," she cried. "Don't die." Tina felt a terrible pain shoot through her chest. She squeezed Kim's hand a final time. Then the heart monitor returned to a steady tone. A nurse shoved Kim back into the corner as Tina popped out of her body again. The pain was gone. I'm not going to rant about the fact that this scene is medical nonsense. It's clear to me that Chad included it because one of the ideas that pops up over and over in near-death experience memoirs is that re-entering the body is incredibly painful. But he included this scene without thinking about how it would affect the other characters, particularly Kim. So she has no reaction to hearing her sister scream, "Oh, the pain," and then seeing her die. It doesn't bother her at all. Then a white light appears over Tina's head, and a voice tells her to come along. Thus ends chapter 5. Before we continue, I have to explain a couple of things about the LDS religion. As always, if there are Mormons watching and I get this wrong, please forgive me and correct me. I've made a simple diagram to help explain this. As I understand it, the LDS Church teaches that when you die, you either go to paradise or spirit prison to await the second coming of Jesus. If you were a good Mormon who had all of your temple ordinances performed, you go to paradise. Everyone else goes to spirit prison, which isn't actually a prison or even an unpleasant place. While you're there, you get to learn about Jesus and have the opportunity to accept him as your savior. Unfortunately, you can't get your temple ordinances performed anywhere except on Earth. So if you die without having them done, Someone on earth has to do them for you. That's where proxy baptism and proxy marriage and all of that comes in. If no one on earth performs your temple ordinances for you, you'll have to wait in spirit prison until the second coming of Christ. At that point, everyone will be sorted into one of 3 heavenly kingdoms, or, if you really suck, banished to outer darkness. Got that? Hopefully the diagram helped. The voice that told Tina to come along belongs to Lucille, Tina's grandmother. Tina's father said his family was dead and claimed to have been raised in foster care, so Tina has never even heard of Lucille, but she recognizes her instantly. Tina sensed they had been dear friends before her birth. Naturally, because this is a Chad Daybell story, we don't get any description of how Tina sensed this. She just looked at Lucille and knew. Suddenly, Tina experiences a complete life review. I think Chad included this because it's another NDE trope and he felt obligated, but he clearly doesn't feel it's an important part of the story because he just blitzes through it in a couple of seconds. Then he writes this. Tina also felt the effects her actions had caused over the years. She didn't like the way she had often treated her family and friends. She realized she had been quite self-centered and now felt a bit guilty. As the images faded, she found Grandma Lucille standing patiently nearby. I sure messed up a lot in those 15 years, she said. If there is a heaven, I'm not getting in. Is there a chance I can go back and apologize to everyone? There's something going on with Chad and accountability. I first noticed it in his 3rd book, when Emma meets Jesus and is instantly stricken by debilitating shame at the memory of her bad acts. Tina feels guilty about what I imagine are minor bad acts. Jesus reassures Emma that she's done a fantastic job, and Grandma Lucille reassures Tina in the same way. I'm going to hold off saying more about this curious phenomenon for the moment, but keep it in the back of your mind. Tina and Grandma Lucille fly into the light and out the other side. It's not clear where the light comes from, it's just somewhere above, and they float up into it, I guess. It doesn't really say. With a final burst, they emerged into a beautiful meadow filled with colorful, unusual plants. They glided smoothly over miles of lush, gorgeous landscape, and soon a small city appeared below them. I swear, reading Chad's descriptions of places is like having a bonbon dangled from a string a couple of feet out of reach. What are these unusual plants? Why would you tell us they're unusual and then refuse to tell us how they're unusual? Were they purple and orange? Were they itty-bitty? Did they have eyes? I want to know. Grandma Lucille takes Tina to her new apartment in Spirit Prison. Lucille led Tina inside a spacious room. It reminded Tina of those spacious Manhattan studio apartments she had seen on TV shows. In the center of the room was a circular table with a large basket of the most delicious-looking bananas, apples, and pears Tina had ever seen. Spacious Manhattan studio apartments? If you get this reference, let me know. I think Chad was thinking of the apartment on Friends, and he doesn't know what a studio apartment is. Tina's apartment sounds more like an office break room. Grandma Lucille says there's no bed because they don't have to sleep anymore, to which Tina says, "Does it ever get dark here?" Tina asked. "No. The light of Jesus Christ radiates throughout the spirit world." Jesus Christ? You mean he's a real person? Chad has this deep-seated belief that people who aren't LDS think Jesus is a fairy tale. Granted, we don't have conclusive historical evidence that he was the same person discussed in the Bible, but non-Christians are aware he was probably a real person. Also, we see another example of Chad's literalness here. Jesus is the light of the world. Literally. He is a literal light bulb in this story. And the image in my head is much funnier than it should be. What I find most perplexing about this, though, is that Jesus isn't always in Spirit Prison. He has a home there, which he visits sometimes. They mention it later. But does that mean that Spirit Prison is dark when Jesus is anywhere else? Is that the implication here? I feel like Chad wants to have it both ways. Grandma Lucille explains that Tina's father was raised Mormon, but he left the church, something he never told Tina, or his wife, or his other daughter. Your father made some serious errors in his late teenage years. He left the church and joined the Air Force. He has blocked Mormonism out of your family's life because he's afraid he would have to tell you about his past mistakes. This has kept your entire family from progressing spiritually. Tina was getting irritated. Was it possible her father would purposely betray her? Look how fast Tina goes from loving her father to thinking he might be evil. As far as I can tell, his only sin was leaving the church, and we never find out why he left the church. He just did. Tina says she isn't worried that her father left the church because she has this nice apartment to live in, and Grandma Lucille says, yes, this place is nicer than Earth, but it doesn't compare to where the rest of the family lives. We live in a place called paradise. I live in a large mansion with your grandpa, and our ancestors live near us. It is glorious, and I'm sad you can't come live with us. Tina was shocked. I can't go there? This is the first mention of mansions, but it will not be the last. As far as Chad is concerned, the most important thing about paradise is getting your mansion. The actual origins of this seem to be biblical. This is John 14, verse 2, where Jesus says to his disciples, "My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you?" As always, Chad takes this idea very literally, although he's not the only one. I've found it in a number of LDS near-death experience memoirs. Here's an especially interesting one from Beyond the Veil 3, in a chapter called Good Deeds Determined the Size of the House. We saw many beautiful homes. He pointed out Joseph Smith's home. I was surprised to see that while many of the homes were spacious, others were very small. Some were barely larger than a small kitchen or large bathroom. I couldn't imagine why anyone would want to live in a house so small. I asked my brother about this. That was all the material they sent up, was his strange reply. What do you mean? I asked. That was all the good works they sent up, he replied, meaning that the size of the house one gets in paradise or heaven is determined by the quantity and quality of the good deeds we perform. What's noteworthy here is that mansions are the only thing Chad identifies about paradise. These near-death experience memoirs are full of descriptions of paradise. There's pretty much always a description of the plant life, the people, the clothing. With Chad, it's just unusual plants and mansions. He never says anything about paradise other than that it's full of mansions. He tries to convince everyone that he doesn't care about material possessions, but it's clear the man desperately wants to own a mansion. So I made this. Tina's mad she didn't get a mansion either. Tina felt completely deflated after hearing those words. Just moments before, she had been very pleased with her new apartment, but now she knew the rest of the family was living somewhere she wasn't even allowed to visit. That apartment from Friends looked pretty nice until you realized Grandma Lucille was living in the White House, didn't it? For all Chad insists he's a spiritual person who's above earthly concerns, he's incredibly materialistic. Thus ends chapter 6. Grandma Lucille takes Tina to a sort of orientation session led by Tina's grandfather, Grandpa Samuel. "Welcome to the spirit worlds, my friend," he said warmly. "Most of you are descended in one way or another from Benjamin Franklin Marlar and his wife Mary, who lived in the United States during the 1800s. Let me show you what they looked like." Yeah, he stole this idea from the near-death experience account of James W. LeSueur, as recounted in Life Everlasting. In answer to the query in my mind, the angel said, "This young lady is a relative of yours, assisting as a missionary among the spirits of your kindred who died without a knowledge of the gospel. While living in mortality, she was killed, and all those you see in this room are your relatives assembled to hear the gospel taught." I looked over the large, well-lighted, well-arranged auditorium. I was pleased with its beauty and simplicity. The speaker's pulpit was in the center of the hall, fully 20 feet lower than where I stood. The seats were arranged in a circle, beginning on a level with the speaker's floor and rising, each tier higher than the other, so that the speaker could see everyone present and they did not seem to be very far away from him. I estimated an audience of 10 to 12,000, seated all in a state of expectancy, as though they were waiting for something with keen anticipation. Now, I don't know why these orientations are chock full of the descendants of one person, or how that's possible. According to Chad's version, there are at least 24 descendants, so maybe the annual family cruise didn't end well. But Lesueur's claim that there were 10 to 12,000 people just makes no sense to me. I also want to point out that Benjamin Franklin Marlar and Mary were real people. Here's Benjamin's tombstone. Chad knows about them because Lucille Marlar was Tammy's grandmother, which he talks about in his autobiography. Benjamin Franklin Marlar is a real ancestor of Tammy's. Grandpa Samuel explains about the spirit world, which causes some people to freak out. We are actually still on Earth, but in another dimension or sphere. One big difference you may have already realized is earthly wealth and fame don't help you here. You may have held very important positions on Earth, but as you've noticed, you can't take it with you. One man wearing a fancy suit called out, "You can say that again. I had 5 large homes all over the world and $2 million in the bank. Now all I get is a crummy apartment? You call that fair?" "In many ways, it is fair," Samuel said. "Now everything is on an even playing field. The important thing now is whether or not you accept true eternal principles. That will determine your future." This is basically Chad's fantasy, right? In paradise, instead of rich people getting all the mansions, spiritually enlightened people get the mansions. Once again, his inferiority complex about money is showing itself. Tina, who has been living under a rock for the last 15 years, is surprised to learn about Jesus. Samuel then explained the role of Jesus Christ in the overall plan. Tina was surprised to learn Jesus had actually helped create the earth, and that his death had been a sacrifice for all mankind. Now, the bit about Jesus helping create the earth is exclusive to the LDS religion, but everyone in America knows that Jesus' death was a sacrifice for all mankind. It is literally painted on billboards on the sides of highways here. This just isn't realistic. Grandpa Samuel says that the true church is the LDS church, and half the audience flips out and leaves what has essentially become a spiritual timeshare presentation. One lady yelled, "I'm a Catholic and will always be a Catholic. Don't tell me those teenagers in white shirts and ties that kept knocking on my door were telling the truth. I don't believe it." It's interesting that her complaint is rooted in her pride. It's not a doctrinal complaint. She didn't recognize the true church when its missionaries were standing on her doorstep, and now she doesn't want to admit she was wrong. The idea of being right and how important it is to be right is going to become a very prominent idea in Chad's next book. Tina has been sitting next to a girl named Ellen, who has green hair and a black leather miniskirt, so we pretty much know she's not going to accept the gospel. Ellen suddenly stood. "You can't tell me how to live my life," she shouted at Samuel. "Nobody tells me what to do." She turned to Tina and said, "Let's go. He might be your grandpa, but he's crazy." Tina didn't move. "You can leave if you want," Tina said. "I think I'll stay." "You believe this stuff?" Ellen asked. "Actually, I do." Like all Chad's converts, Tina instantly knows that the Book of Mormon is true. Ellen, on the other hand, just goes bonkers and attacks Grandpa Samuel and is dragged screaming from the building by guards. Thus ends chapter 7. Grandpa Samuel then launches into a presentation of the entire events of the Bible and the Book of Mormon, which only takes 3 or 4 months. One man begins crying when he realizes that by not following up with those missionaries who stopped by, he's jeopardized his eternal salvation. Grandpa Samuel reassures him. "It is too bad you didn't listen to the missionaries, because it would have blessed your entire family. But we also have missionaries here in the spirit world. Would you be interested in having them visit you?" The man's face changed completely from sadness to joy. "There are missionaries here?" he asked. Yes, send them to me. Samuel said he would. Then he turned and said, Tina, how about you? That would be wonderful, she said. I can't wait. I have to admit, I find the man and Tina's enthusiasm just a bit over the top. Grandpa Samuel tells everyone to go back to their spacious studio apartments and ponder what they've learned, because the missionaries are already on their way. Thus ends chapter 8. On her way back to her apartment, Tina runs into a woman in a red dress. This spirit, Ruby, is a relative and claims to be Tina's guardian angel, but I think the red dress should have been a clue. What did you think of the message in there? I thought it was great, Tina said. It all makes sense to me. I hope to make it to paradise. The woman arched her eyebrows in surprise. Really? Look around you. This place is so much better than Earth. Do you really think there's someplace better than this? I mean, Chad hasn't really described the place, so I don't know if it's better than Earth. I have no idea. Obviously, Ruby hasn't walked the straight and narrow. She's not a fan of her cousin Lucille either. Tina was surprised at the woman's words. Well, Grandma Lucille said she lives in a mansion in a place called Paradise. The woman suddenly frowned. Lucille tells that to everybody, but don't believe everything she says. All she did on Earth was take care of her children. Does that merit having a mansion? I don't think so. I worked myself to the bone in the business world, and what did I get? A one-room apartment. I don't believe her stories about having a mansion, and neither should you. So in short, Ruby doesn't believe that Lucille has a mansion because she can't comprehend that wealth on Earth and wealth in heaven are based on different metrics. She's not the brightest. She offers to show Tina the more interesting parts of Spirit Prison. She pointed down a path to another plaza where people were laughing and dancing to music. It did look fun, but Tina felt she should follow her grandpa's advice to return to her room. Once again, Chad equates godlessness with dancing. Chad's trial is going on while I'm working on this, and one of the things that came out that I hadn't heard before was an email from Charles Vallow to Lori demanding to know why she sent Chad videos of herself dancing. I guess Chad fell for her enticements. Tina turns Ruby down and returns to her apartment, but Ruby follows her. Thus ends chapter 9. Ruby tries to talk her way into Tina's room, but she's interrupted by another spirit, another Marlar family relative, in fact, named Ida. Ida chases Ruby off. Then she gives Tina the 411 on Ruby's past. Drinking, staying out all night with strange men, you name it and Ruby has done it. She never married, and she spent her life as a secretary. She usually ended up in an affair with her boss, often ruining his life. Then she would move on to another job. After she died, she still had those same dark desires. Satan's followers easily recruited her, and she's been the family pest ever since. Chad offers no compassion to his characters. Even if Ruby was some sort of Black Widow secretary who went from job to job destroying her boss's marriages, doesn't that merit some sympathy toward a woman who was clearly unhappy in life? No. This is how Tina responds. Hold on, Tina said. Satan? The devil? He's real? I just keep thinking of that little girl, who coincidentally I think is also named Ruby, in National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, who says, Santa Claus is real? Like, I imagine the exact same expression on Tina's face. So Ida tells Tina her own life story. She's been in spirit prison for decades, waiting for someone on Earth to do her temple work so that she can go to paradise. She died shortly after her 8th birthday, and this is the root of the problem. If you die before age 8, you automatically go to paradise. For example, my younger sister Martha died at age 6, and she went directly there. But I lived from January 11th, 1871 to March 15th, 1879, just over 8 years, and just a little too long to qualify. The Lord's kingdom is governed by laws, and I lived to the age of accountability. That seems unfair, Tina said. Isn't there a way to appeal? No, there isn't. Ida is going to be stuck in spirit prison until the second coming of Jesus, unless someone on Earth does her temple work, and she thinks it's her own fault. I'm just a victim of circumstance. My body is buried in a forgotten grave in Osborne, Kansas. My burial records are there in the courthouse, but no one knows they need to look for me. It's my own fault, I guess. What do you mean? Tina asked. Well, I wouldn't have died so young if I'd obeyed my mother, but it was such a beautiful spring day. The prairie grass was just starting to grow, and there was a little spot down by the stream I loved. There was a large, smooth rock I would sit on and let the sun warm me. But that particular day, Mother told me to stay in the house. She had a feeling something terrible was going to happen. She disobeyed her mother, went outside, and was killed by a snake. And for that, she deserves to spend 100 plus years in spirit prison. I'm pretty sure Chad stole this idea from a near-death experience account published in 1886 that was reprinted in not one but two of the books Chad read. Note the similarities. As I was departing, my mother said, "Charles John, you must not go into the water." I fully intended to comply with this wish, but when I reached the pasture, I set aside my scruples regarding disobedience to my parent. I think it's interesting that a river appears in both of these versions. The narrator plays in the water with a friend, then gets trapped under a log and drowns, and he's reprimanded in the spirit world. They told me that my death was caused by disobedience to my parent. I felt keenly on this point, and informed them that if I were allowed to re-enter my body, I should never be guilty of the same sin again. Yeah, I'm sure he came back and never disobeyed his parents a single time for the rest of his life. I'm sure that this idea that defying an authority figure could get you killed appealed to Chad's desire to control others. I'm sure he's a very controlling father. We've seen indications of that all over the place. Ida, however, seems resigned to her fate. Fun aside, the man who edited these Beyond the Veil books, Lee Nelson, was also Chad's boss at Cedar Fort. Just thought that was interesting. Thus ends chapter 10. Ida departs and Lucille returns, and Chad completely forgets that Tina was waiting for missionaries to come talk to her. We never hear about that again. Instead, Lucille informs Tina that they're going to attend Tina's funeral on Earth. At the funeral, Tina's sister Kim gets up to speak, but what she says is not exactly a eulogy. She doesn't talk about Tina at all. Instead, she talks about her new Mormon friend Nicole and reads from the Book of Mormon about where souls go when they die, and then explains that she thinks Tina is probably in spirit prison. It's super weird. Kim wiped her eyes. I know Tina isn't with the devil. She was a good-hearted person. But I'm not sure she is in paradise because she wasn't religious. I wish Nicole could have been here to tell you more about it, but she had to go out of town to a family reunion. She wanted to stay for the funeral, but I told her I would be alright. Thanks for letting us know about the family reunion, Kim. Important stuff. Seriously, though, I think the only worse eulogy I've heard is the one Chad gave for Tammy, where he called her lazy. Chad says that a priest gives a sermon at Tina's funeral, which doesn't really make any sense, because priests are generally Episcopalian or Catholic, and they don't just attend to any funeral. You have to be a member of those religions for them to do your funeral. For another, they don't give traditional sermons at funerals. I've never heard a traditional sermon at a funeral in any religion. Usually, the religious leader sticks to talking about the deceased person and maybe a bit about their faith. But Chad doesn't seem to be aware of any of that. The priest gave a rousing sermon on earning a heavenly reward, but Tina didn't like his message very much. He said it was God's will that she had died, and now her fate was in God's hands. Tina frowned. The priest made it sound like God would flip a coin on whether she would be with God or with the devil. It sounded very hollow to her, and the audience didn't seem to like it very much either. Tina found it interesting that Kim's message was much more accurate than the message from a priest who spent his whole life preaching to people. Chad has so many wrong ideas about other religions. I've never heard of any religion, let alone a Christian denomination, where your fate after death is determined by a coin flip. And this last line here about how inaccurate the priest is, but how the LDS message is accurate, it just underlines Chad's smugness and his certainty that he's right about everything and everyone else is wrong. Tina tells Lucille that she doesn't want to go to the graveside burial service because she doesn't like seeing her family unhappy. But Lucille isn't having it. Lucille gave her a stern look. Someday your spirit and body will be resurrected, and you'll need to know where your body is. A lot of people have asked why Chad didn't have Tammy cremated, and I think it's probably rooted in this belief that your physical body is going to be resurrected after Jesus returns. Numerous NDE memoirs mention the importance of knowing where your body is buried for this reason. It's so that you can find it after the second coming. Cremation is fairly uncommon in the LDS community, and I suspect Chad couldn't have had Tammy cremated without causing his children to become a bit suspicious. At the graveside service, Roger tells Tina's father, Frank, that she was tutoring him at the library the night she died, so her death must be his fault. And Frank agrees with him and turns purple with rage. He demands to know if Roger is a Mormon, then tells Kim he was embarrassed by her eulogy. Kim calmly said, "Dad, I know what Nicole is teaching me is true. I now believe in God, which is something I have never learned about in our home. My heart burns when I talk to Nicole about Mormonism." Yeah, that sounds like a 17-year-old. The Marlars have a big blowout in the cemetery, and Carmen ends up kicking Frank out of the house. Thus ends chapter 11. For reasons unknown, Tina and Grandma Lucille hang around the cemetery after the funeral ends. They see the spirit of a young man trying to apologize to his living mother, and Lucille explains who he is. His parents spoiled him all his life, but when he turned 18, they told him he had to get a job. He ended his life instead. Chad stole this from Return from Tomorrow. In one house, a younger man followed an older one from room to room. "I'm sorry, Pa," he kept saying. "I didn't know what it would do to Mama. I didn't understand." But though I could hear him clearly, it was obvious that the man he was speaking to could not. The old man was carrying a tray into a room where an elderly woman sat in bed. "I'm sorry, Pa," the young man said again. "I'm sorry, Mama." Endlessly, over and over, to ears that could not hear. In bafflement, I turned to the brightness beside me. But though I felt his compassion flow like a torrent into the room before us, no understanding lighted my mind. Several times we paused before similar scenes. A boy trailing a teenage girl through the corridors of a school. "I'm sorry, Nancy." A middle-aged woman begging a gray-haired man to forgive her. "What are they so sorry for, Jesus?" I pleaded. "Why do they keep talking to people who can't hear them?" Then from the light beside me came the thought, they are chained to every consequence of their act. I think it's worth noting that Return from Tomorrow handles the subject with much more compassion than Chad does. Grandma Lucille then takes Tina out to the desert, where thousands of spirits are brawling with each other. Tina saw one woman call a man terrible names. Then she grabbed him by the throat and threw him across the desert. He came right back at her and smashed his fist into her face. Her head snapped back further than seemed possible, and then she straightened up and kicked him in the stomach. Since they were spirits, they couldn't harm each other, but it still looked painful. All around were similar scenes. Tina could feel the incredible anger these people carried. "I don't understand," Tina told Lucille. "They seem so bloodthirsty." "That's right," Lucille said. "Some of these spirits were among the first to come to Earth, and they have been wandering the land for thousands of years. They are carnally minded and have stopped progressing. Their souls have shrunk to almost nothing." I was initially baffled by the inclusion of this scene. Then I read Return from Tomorrow and realized that the reason the scene doesn't make sense is that Chad ripped it off from a scene he didn't understand. I'm going to quote it in some length here so that you can see both what Chad stole and what he missed. This book and the spiritual vision it presents are quite sophisticated, and I believe originate in genuine spiritual wisdom. The plane was crowded, even jammed with hordes of ghostly discarnate beings. Nowhere was there a solid, light-surrounded person to be seen. All of these thousands of people were apparently no more substantial than I myself, and they were the most frustrated, the angriest, the most completely miserable beings I had ever laid eyes on. "Lord Jesus," I cried, "where are we?" At first I thought we were looking at some great battlefield. Everywhere people were locked in what looked like fights to the death, writhing, punching, gouging. It could not be a present-day war because there were no tanks or guns. No weapons of any sort, I saw as I looked closer, only bare hands and feet and teeth. and then I noticed that no one was apparently being injured. There was no blood, no bodies strewed the ground. A blow that ought to have eliminated an opponent would leave him exactly as before. Although they appeared to be literally on top of each other, it was as though each man was boxing the air. At last I realized that, of course, having no substance, they could not actually touch one another. They could not kill, though they clearly wanted to, because their intended victims were already dead, and so they hurled themselves at each other in a frenzy of impotent rage. The author, whose name is George, realizes that all of the spirit's thoughts are telepathically broadcast. Whatever anyone thought, however fleetingly or unwillingly, was instantly apparent to all around him, more completely than words could have expressed it, faster than sound waves could have carried it. And the thoughts most frequently communicated had to do with the superior knowledge or abilities or background of the thinker. "I told you so." "I always knew." "Didn't I warn you?" were shrieked into the echoing air over and over. With a feeling of sick familiarity, I recognized here my own thinking. This was me, my very tone of voice, the righteous one, the award winner, the churchgoer. At age 20, I had not yet developed any truly changing physical habits, not like the beings I had seen scrabbling to get close to that bar. But in these yelps of envy and wounded self-importance, I heard myself all too well. He's horrified by this realization, but it leads him to understanding why these spirits are stuck fighting. What was it going to be like, I thought with sudden panic, to live forever where my most private thoughts were not private at all? No disguising them, no covering them up, no way to pretend I was anything but what I actually was. How unbearable. Unless, of course, everyone around me had the same kinds of thoughts. Unless there was a kind of consolation in finding others as loathsome as oneself, even if all we could do was hurl our venom at each other. Perhaps this was the explanation for this hideous plane. Perhaps in the course of eons or of seconds, each creature here had sought out the company of others as pride and hate-filled as himself, until together they formed this society of the damned. Like Chad, these spirits did it to themselves. Tina asks Grandma Lucille if she can ever contact her family on Earth. Lucille smiled kindly. Heavenly Father's kingdom is a place of order, and contact between the different spheres is purposely limited. She motioned back toward the rampaging spirits. Those people have rejected the gospel plan, and no longer follow the laws of heaven. So they can do whatever they want, haunt houses, fight each other, or whatever. But those who follow the Savior obey his laws. Righteous spirits don't contact mortals, or alter the mortal world in any way, unless they are instructed to or receive special permission. This idea came from Life Everlasting. Spirits who reside in paradise are carefully organized and controlled through principles of righteousness. They are not free to wander about the earth without an assigned purpose. In contrast, the spirits under Satan's influence are given ample opportunity to haunt the earth and create whatever mischief and evil they choose. Grandma Lucille then decides to show Tina the different parts of Spirit Prison, some of which are rowdier than others. And you can guess what the evil spirits are doing with their spare time. Spirit Prison dance party. They travel even further and hovered above hundreds of spirits dancing on top of a building. A group of men were playing hypnotic music. Tina could feel the music's deadening pulse. The music gave her the same cold feeling as when Ruby had touched her elbow. Then Tina spotted a familiar girl wearing a black miniskirt. She was dancing wildly and seemed to be enjoying herself. The girl in the miniskirt is Ellen, the one who lost her cool and tried to throttle Grandpa Samuel during his afterlife timeshare presentation. She's gone to the dark side. Grandma Lucille adds, "The missionaries are still working with her, but it's hard to compete with that kind of entertainment." This reminds me of Emma's mother's description of Lincoln Point in Chad's third novel, where she used the words enticements. Here it's entertainment. Chad is starting to develop a real problem with recreation, which we'll see more intensely as time passes. Tina is upset by the sight of dancing, as anyone would be, and flies back to her spacious studio apartment. Thus ends chapter 12. The missionaries who were going to talk to Tina must have given up and left because they aren't at the apartment. Instead, Tina meets her father's sister, Evelyn, and they talk with Grandma Lucille about Frank's problem with Mormons. If Kim finds out Frank was once a Mormon, he'll have to explain why he left the church. He realizes he doesn't have a good explanation. I think Chad's the one with no explanation. Why did Frank leave the church? What are these rules he broke? At no point is any of this ever explained. Grandma Lucille says Frank's problems will only get worse when he dies. He used to share the most beautiful testimony each fast Sunday, but he turned away, and the Lord must deal fairly with someone who has received so much light and knowledge. I think this is interesting for its implication. One of the things that we've heard Lori say to Melanie Gibb in the infamous Korihor call, that's what I call it, the phone call she recorded where she demanded to know why Lori told the police that she had JJ, in which she ends up calling Lori a Korihor. Lori says at one point that Melanie is going to be held responsible for all of the knowledge that she has. And then she mentioned it again in one of the phone calls that Ian Pulowski recorded. I don't know exactly what's being alluded to here in Chad's book. It sounds like God is going to punish Frank for turning his back on the church. I did find this reference in Life Everlasting. The gospel will be taught to all in the spirit prison who have not had the opportunity to hear it. They will have their agency to accept or reject it as they choose. If they accept the gospel and the vicarious ordinances performed in their behalf on earth, they are permitted to leave the spirit prison and dwell in paradise. If necessary, they are punished for their earthly sins while in the spirit prison. Now, it doesn't say what form these punishments take, and it isn't clear whether this is just something that happens to people who didn't hear the gospel before they died, which wouldn't apply to Frank. But it's the only reference I found to any kind of punishment in the spirit world, so I'm assuming it had some influence on Chad. Grandma Lucille goes on to explain that if Frank doesn't accept the gospel, he'll end up in the least wonderful of the three heavens after the second coming. This heaven he's going to go to is called the Celestial Kingdom. It is also a beautiful place of glory, but those who inherit this kingdom are the liars and murderers, like the spirits we saw fighting each other in the desert. All these spirits will eventually receive a resurrected body, but they will be cut off forever from Heavenly Father and the Savior. Doesn't sound that bad to me. An unspecified amount of time then passes, during which Tina's Aunt Evelyn teaches her the gospel. The more spiritual Tina becomes, the more she wants a bigger house. Tina's only desire was to enter into the Savior's kingdom through baptism. Her little room was feeling more like a prison cell. One day, Grandma Lucille informs her that because she's accepted Jesus into her heart, she's now allowed to wear a white dress. Apparently, the exact shade of whiteness of the clothing corresponds to one's spiritual status. Tina gazed at it with wonder. It wasn't the brilliant white of Lucille and Evelyn's robes, but it was so much better than the everyday clothes she had worn since arriving in the spirit world. They helped her slip out of her other clothes and into the dress. It felt spectacular, and shimmered almost as if it were alive. Compare this to Ruby's red dress and Ellen's black miniskirt. Chad's love of white clothing comes straight from the LDS Church. In fact, according to Jordan and McKay, you can't even wear your wedding dress into the temple if it isn't bleach white. No eggshell, no ecru, no cream. But I think Chad takes it to another level by directly associating the degree of whiteness with the degree of spiritual attainment. Ida informs Tina that now that she has a white dress, they can go to the learning center together, and they decide to go right then. Thus ends chapter 13. Chad never explains exactly what the learning center is. Tina just goes there and asks to see how her parents met, and they show her a video of her parents meeting. There are a lot of depictions of like libraries in NDE memoirs, but I never read anything else where you could see how your own parents met, where there was like secret security footage of everything that had ever happened. Tina's mother came to the US from Peru, And Chad seems to think that if you aren't a U.S. citizen, the only place you can marry a citizen is in Vegas. I don't know why he thinks that or where that idea came from. Tina learns at the Learning Center that if her father hadn't left the church, he would have been sent to Peru as a missionary and met Carmen there, and her entire family would have been converted. Tina's pretty miffed that he messed up God's plan. Tina and Ida then go to some worship services together. These are meetings for people who have accepted the gospel but can't go to paradise because their temple work hasn't been done. They become friendly with a family whose members have been waiting to go to paradise for a long time, and they've just received word that one of their descendants has finally submitted their names to a temple so that they can get their proxy ordinances. Ida is a bit jealous. Ida was sincerely happy for them, but afterwards she told Tina, "It feels like I keep taking second place in a cow milking contest. I'm never going to win the prize." Isn't faith its own reward? Does it really need to have a prize? Why is Chad comparing spiritual attainment to a contest? I think the answer is obvious. To him, faith isn't its own reward. A relationship with God isn't its own reward. He wants the mansion. Show him the mansion. He wants to win the competition for the most spiritual and get rewarded with a mansion. The great irony of Chad Daybell is that he's a cult leader who writes religious fiction, but he has no true faith and no relationship with God. God is too abstract for Chad to understand, so he tries to make spirituality physical, something he can understand. He makes it physical with white robes and dresses and mansions and a learning center. He even inserts practical, real-world issues into spiritual experiences. This refers to the family that's just had their names submitted for temple work. Soon a message arrived that this group's baptismal work would be done in the Provo Temple within the next few minutes. Tina and Ida embraced each member of the group and enviously bid farewell as each person slipped through the veil, departing to witness their own baptism and confirmation. However, several of the men returned within a short time. They looked very disappointed to still be in spirit prison. One of them explained, "The young men's president of the ward doing the baptisms had to work late, so not all of the young men found a ride to the temple. We have to wait until tomorrow. The rest of the group has crossed over into paradise." Their entry into paradise was waylaid by carpool scheduling. I have a hard time believing God would make these guys stay behind for the night in the spiritual equivalent of an airport hotel when they're going to get the paperwork done tomorrow and the rest of the family has already crossed over. This idea didn't originate with Chad, though. I don't think any idea has ever originated with Chad. This is a story told by President John D. McAllister to J. Hatton Carpenter, who wrote it down, and it's quoted in Life Everlasting. Here, Hatton is describing McAllister as someone who was sitting in the baptismal font room watching proxy baptisms when he had a vision. As he sat and witnessed the ceremony, he became very much interested, as indeed he might be, for he was gazing into the spirit world. To his view appeared the spirits of those for whom they were officiating in the font by proxy. There the spirits stood awaiting their turn, and, as the recorder called out the name of a person to be baptized for, the patriarch noticed a pleasant smile come over the face of the spirit whose name had been called, and he would leave the group of fellow spirits and pass over to the side of the recorder. There he would watch his own baptism performed by proxy, and then with a joyful countenance would pass away, making room for the next favored personage who was to enjoy the same privilege. As the eyes of Brother C were riveted on this beautiful scene, he noticed at last that some were beginning to turn away with sorrowful countenances. Then his mind and sight came to things material. He looked around him and saw that the font room was nearly empty, the day's baptisms were at an end, and the recorder was gathering up his records and stepping down from his desk. "I often think of this event," says Brother Carpenter, "for I so often sit at the font and call off the names for the ordinances to be performed which mean so much to the dead." Another version of this story was told by Edward J. Wood. A few years after the opening of our temple for ordinance work, One of the temple workers, President Deuce, who had spent several years in active temple work in the Logan Temple and was now with us in the Alberta Temple, was sitting in the sealing room. He stated that he saw the main corridor to the sealing room filled with people looking into the sealing room and taking note as sealing ordinances were administered for one person after another in the relationship of wives to husbands or children to parents. He said that he saw plainly as each person's work was done, he or she would shake hands with the people still waiting in the corridor and would apparently go away. When the work in the sealing room was finished, he still saw very many waiting in the corridor. They were apparently very much disappointed in knowing that the work was finished for the day and no work was done for them. This leads us to believe that there are a good many people in the spirit world who know just what is being done in the temple, and that when the work is not done for them, they are greatly disappointed. Personally, I think God would have let them through. I just think God is bigger than a prissy middle management type who's obsessed with the paperwork. I think God's nicer than that. But that's my personal opinion, and that's the end of chapter 14. Grandma Lucille informs Tina that the Marlar family's governing council has agreed to listen to any ideas Tina has for how to influence her father to return to the church. This family council thing never really gets explained. Chad describes it, but he's sort of fixated on a particular characteristic of the men on the council. On the far side of the room, several men sat behind a long marble table. Tina studied them silently while the men concluded a matter of business. They all wore white robes and looked very distinguished, but they were a curious mixture of age, size, and facial hair. A few had bushy beards, 2 had mustaches, and the rest were clean-shaven. A gray-haired, clean-shaven man seated at the center of the table took the lead. Why do we need to hear so much about their facial hair? This choice to describe a group based on hair is one Chad will make again in his next book, by the way. It's inexplicable to me. The council asks Tina what she's proposing to do about her father, which is weird because at this point she hasn't proposed to do anything. The council's the one who called this meeting. But she comes up with an idea. Sort of. Then Tina paused as a flash of inspiration came to her. So I humbly ask that I may return to Earth and do all I can to influence my family to choose righteousness, especially my father. So the plan is to go back to Earth and then figure out what to do? Instead of a plan, you're proposing that you go home and make a plan? While the council discusses this in private, Grandma Lucille commends Tina. You did very well, Lucille said. I hope so, Tina said. That idea came out of nowhere. I feel it was inspired, Lucille said. There was no idea. The idea was to come up with an idea later. That's a terrible idea. It's exactly like Doug's dilemma. He never had a dilemma. But the council likes this idea for some reason, and President Tanner says this. Tina, we can see the wisdom in allowing you to work in your family's behalf. However, we also must ensure that your family members continue to develop faith. Seeing an angel at this point wouldn't help them in the long run. Therefore, we can't allow you to directly affect their lives through a visitation or cause anything out of the ordinary to happen in the mortal world. If such an incident happens, your assignment will end immediately. So she has no plan except to make a plan later, but the plan can't involve contacting her family or causing anything unusual to happen. So what exactly is Tina going to do? How is she going to affect her family if she isn't allowed to affect them in any way? And aren't all spiritual experiences sort of out of the ordinary? Isn't that what makes them incredible? Thus ends chapter 15. Grandma Lucille takes Tina back to Earth and tells her not to do anything to make her father paranoid, then leaves. Tina wanders around without any idea what to do, because she has no plan, and ends up at the LDS temple, where she chats with a resurrected spirit named Aaron, who guards the temple from the armies of Satan. His explanation of how he came to be resurrected is long and confusing, and I don't understand why he's invisible to mortals if he has a physical body, which the Doctrine and Covenants says he would, but none of that seems to matter. I think Aaron only appears in this story because Chad wanted to have a battle scene, which begins with one of his terrible anti-descriptions. Coming from the west were thousands of spirits that can only be described as demons. They looked horrendous. That's all he says. A slew of resurrected warriors battle the demons while Tina looks on, but the fight is thoroughly PG-13. It was as real as any battle Tina had ever seen, except there wasn't any blood. Aaron and his friends win the battle. Dawn comes and Tina decides to find her father at work. Instead, she discovers him sleeping in his car in a grocery store parking lot near work. Frank climbed out of the car, stretched, and tucked in his wrinkled shirt. It looked like he'd worn the same clothing for several days. Tina couldn't smell anything in the mortal world, but just by looking at him, she could tell Frank really needed a good shower. Why can't Tina smell anything? She can see and hear and, as we're about to learn, touch things, but she can't smell? This is explicitly contradicted by Parley P. Pratt, who says that the spirit body possesses every organ after the pattern and in the likeness or similitude of the outward or fleshly tabernacle it is designed eventually to inhabit. Its organs of thought, speech, sight, hearing, tasting, smelling, feeling, etc. all exist in their order as in the physical body, the one being the exact similitude of the other. I guess Chad didn't bother reading the footnotes. Also, don't Air Force bases usually have barracks? Couldn't Frank sleep and shower there? I don't know. Frank drives to work while listening to an old country song called Going Through the Big D and Don't Mean Dallas, which refers to divorce. Tina is upset by the message of the song, and it is a pretty terrible song, so she switches the radio to her favorite station. Now, obviously, this is disobeying President Tanner's instructions not to cause anything out of the ordinary to happen, but she does it twice more anyway. Frank arrives at work visibly shaken, can't get anything done, and has to ask his boss for the rest of the day off so that he can go back to his car. Thus ends chapter 16. Frank is a plane mechanic in the Air Force. He's cleaning up his workstation before going back to his car, I guess, when he has an accident. He had been using a pan of solvent to clean the grime off some of the engine parts, and as he turned to dispose of it, the pan slipped out of his hand. It hit the ground, splashing solvent along his right leg. Frank's eyes grew wide as he saw a coworker's carelessly tossed cigarette just a few feet away. "This is a no-smoking zone," he muttered. If the solvent vapors reached that cigarette... Whoosh! A stream of flame shot across the room, and in an instant, Frank's pant leg was on fire with flames as high as his face. As it happens, my partner used to work in an airplane mechanic shop, and we had this little text exchange regarding the plausibility of this scene. Frank has never heard of stop, drop, and roll, and he tries to pat the flames out with his hands. Finally, a coworker assists, but by then Frank's leg is all burned up, and he has to be taken to the burn unit at the hospital, where he breaks down and calls his wife. Carmen and Kim come to see him, and they sort of awkwardly make up and agree that he can come home when he's released. Afterward, Carmen tells Kim to lay off the Mormonism stuff for a while, and Kim agrees. Kim's working on a memorial website for Tina, and Tina tries to comfort her by screaming, "Don't worry about me. I'm fine. Worry about yourself," which causes Kim to get really anxious and call for her mother. Carmen apparently can sense spirits and tells Tina to leave them alone because it never occurs to her that the spirit might be that of her daughter who's been dead for only 2 weeks. Thus ends chapter 17. The next day, while Kim is at school and Frank's passed out on pain meds on the couch, Carmen investigates the spirit in Kim's bedroom. Tina wants her mother to read the Book of Mormon, so she tries to nudge it out from under some papers on the corner of a desk, but she accidentally flings it across the room at her mother instead. Carmen's nerves snapped. She picked up the book and ripped all the pages from the spine. "You don't scare me," she whispered fiercely. Then she gathered up all the pages and carried them outside to the trash can. Not the inside trash. That's going in the outside trash. I can't really blame Carmen for this. I probably would have freaked out too. Grandma Lucille instantly sucks Tina back to spirit prison and lectures her for interfering with the physical world. I would have expected her to do that after she distracted her father to the point he sustained third-degree burns, but apparently that's not on par with chucking a paperback. Grandma Lucille finally explains what Tina's supposed to be doing in the mortal world. I told you plainly that we can't interfere in the physical world. We have to use our feelings, spirit to spirit. Well, that's slightly clearer. Thus ends chapter 18. Now back in her spacious Manhattan-style apartment, Tina receives a visit from Ida, who tells her a story from her afterlife. It doesn't have anything to do with anything, but it irritates me, so I'm going to share it. Soon after I died and accepted the gospel, I was assigned to the far reaches of spirit prison to work with our ancestors who lived in Europe during the Dark Ages. They required a lot of patience, and they didn't really make much progress. Even teaching them how to be polite was a challenge. First, no one calls it the Dark Ages anymore because it wasn't actually dark. All kinds of intellectual and scientific and artistic leaps were made during the 1,000 years of history being described. Second, people in the Middle Ages had manners. They wrote whole pamphlets on etiquette. And third, why do you need manners to accept the gospel? It's so Chad to assume that having faith, of course, means having manners. You can't be rude and saved. However, I found an interesting reference. This is from James Lucille, the same man who described the auditorium where everyone learned about the gospel. Those in the last room lived upon the earth during the Dark Ages and at the period of great wickedness and ignorance. It would take ages to redeem them. I'm not convinced that the Dark Ages referenced in this quote are the European Dark Ages because of this reference to ignorance. The scene is about people receiving religious instruction in spirit prison, so I would assume that ignorance refers to spiritual ignorance, not intellectual ignorance. Europe between the years of 400 and 1400 was certainly not exclusively Christian, but it was widely Christian. So my hunch is that this refers to people from ages and places where the gospel wasn't available, possibly even, because it's an LDS context, periods between dispensations. If anyone's ignorant here, it's Chad. Grandma Lucille returns and tells Tina that the council is going to give her another chance. She can go back to Earth, but she has to be more careful this time and not move things. She takes Tina back, and Tina finds her father lying on the couch. Tina hovered next to her father, who was watching a talk show featuring men who claimed to be the lost sons of Elvis Presley. This world has problems, she said. Spirit prison wasn't great, but it was certainly better than some of the stuff on Earth. I can't decide if Chad thought this was funny or if he really thinks talk shows are the world's biggest issues. Either interpretation seems plausible. Conveniently, a pair of Mormon missionaries show up on the doorstep. Frank lets them in because he's dropped the TV remote and he can't get it without hurting his leg. This scene is our introduction to Josh Brown, here called Elder Brown because he's currently a missionary. And he's the brother of Doug's girlfriend, Becky, and the grandson of Tex and Ingrid from Chad's second novel. Here's a bit of his small talk. My sister Becky is serving a mission in the Canary Islands right now, and I don't think I'd trade places with her. I've had more baptisms than she had. Because spirituality is a competition, remember? What matters is who gets the most baptisms. Elder Brown and his companion realize that they aren't going to get anywhere with Frank and take their leave. But Tina begins screaming for Elder Brown to leave a Book of Mormon on the porch, and he does. Apparently when Grandma Lucille said that Tina needed to use her feelings to influence others, what she meant was that Tina should scream things until people hear her unconsciously and do what she wants. Sort of a subliminal haunting, if you will. Kim comes home from school and finds the Book of Mormon on the porch. It has Elder Brown's business card in it, and she gives him a call. He tells her he can't baptize her until she's 18 unless she has her parents' permission, which she isn't going to give. But luckily, Kim's 18th birthday is next month. Thus ends chapter 19. A month passes, and suddenly it's Kim's birthday, so the Marlars head to Sizzler to celebrate. In a flashback, we hear how Kim finished reading the Book of Mormon and prayed to know if what she'd read was true. She had been frustrated, but she continued to pray about it, and one night while praying, a strong feeling rushed through her, bringing her to tears. She knew it was the confirmation she had sought. A terrible description of a spiritual experience from a man who's never had an actual spiritual experience. He doesn't even specify which emotion rushed through her. Plus, she seemed pretty convinced that the LDS gospel was true at the funeral. I'm not sure why she had to pray for confirmation now. It seems like she already had it. Kim then throws a wrench in the Sizzler birthday dinner by informing her parents that she's going to be baptized. They aren't happy. Carmen has decided that Mormonism might be evil because of the flying Book of Mormon, and Frank still just hates Mormons. What's interesting about this argument between Kim and her parents is that even Chad can't figure out what they're arguing about. He can't imagine any legitimate argument against joining the church, because heaven forbid he acknowledge any flaws in the LDS church. So his characters act irrationally. Here's a snippet in which Kim seems to be having 3 different arguments. This is about letting me make my own choices, and you two aren't willing to do that. What does it take? I'm a good person, yet I sometimes feel I'll never measure up. Do I have to die like Tina did? So which is it? Is the issue between Kim and her parents that they won't let her make her own decisions? Is it that they don't think she's good enough? Or is it whatever this line about Tina is implying, which I can't even suss out? The logical fallacies just keep piling up. Kim asked her father, I know you don't like the Mormons, but don't you believe in God or Jesus? Frank shrugged uncomfortably. I suppose. Then that means you believe in the Bible, Kim said. No, it doesn't. You can believe in God without believing in the Bible. Billions of people do. Kim uses Matthew 19 verse 29 to justify cutting her parents off, which she threatens to do if they don't support her decision. Then she throws up a colossal straw man argument. Frank says, the Mormons are leading you down the wrong path. Kim's eyes flashed. You really think so? You both know Nicole. She doesn't swear, smoke, drink, or stay out late with boys. You're saying that you would prefer I do those things? No, Kim, that's not what he's saying. You can give up booze and cigarettes regardless of whether or not you convert to Mormonism. Frank saying, I don't want you to be baptized is not the same as saying, I want you to curse and drink and sleep around. I want you to be Mae West, honey. Frank and Carmen relent, but they stand firm against having Tina proxy baptized. Thus ends chapter 20. Elder Brown comes over to teach Kim the first discussion, which is an LDS religious teaching. We don't know exactly what Tina has been doing for the last month, probably just shouting at people, but she's here now, and she's upset to see that Ruby is also attending the missionary discussion. Here's Ruby's justification for messing up the missionary's mission. There must be opposition in all things, Ruby said with a sneer. It's right there in the scriptures. I'm here to make sure both sides get a fair shake. Tina couldn't believe it. Don't you think your side has enough going for it? Teenage girls hardly have a chance. Isn't immodesty, suggestive music, parties, and alcohol enough? So here we get a list of the things Chad thinks are evil. He's talking about the way Satan influences people, and he thinks all about that base is the problem. As in Escape to Zion, we see him misidentifying evil. The scene then immediately goes off the rails. Ruby starts screaming about how Joseph Smith is a fraud and existence ends at death. Not really sure why she's trying to convince them of that. And Tina attacks her. A graphically described violent fight ensues, although Chad also describes it as a classic cat fight. Finally, the living people in the room start to notice that the vibes feel off and say a prayer, and one of the warrior spirits comes and drop kicks Ruby through the floor. Thus ends chapter 21. However, we're going to jump away from the story for a moment, because this scene also derailed Chad's entire writing career. The LDS Church owns a bookstore called Deseret Books. If I understand correctly, all of the books it carries are supposed to be literature appropriate for Mormons to read. Although getting your book into Deseret Books isn't the same as getting an official stamp of approval from the church, It could be seen as a sort of tacit approval from the community. Because it's the official LDS bookstore, Deseret Books has a lot of social and marketing power and a lot of influence over what Mormons are reading. Now, according to an article published by Deseret News, which is an official LDS news publication, Chasing Paradise was supposed to be featured in a Deseret Books advertising catalog sent to bookstores. But a book buyer who worked for Deseret Books read Chasing Paradise and found it objectionable. Specifically, she found this scene objectionable and said it was irreverent, which I assume means she thinks angels shouldn't be committing acts of violence. Now, other officials at Deseret Books said that the book simply wasn't well written enough to carry and pointed out that Chad's adult fiction didn't sell very well. Although it's worth noting that the children's books he and Tammy wrote together, by which I mean were probably written by Tammy and then Chad stuck his name on them, just a theory, those were selling well. Chad claimed in the article that he was being unfairly singled out because he was LDS and that non-LDS authors weren't being held to the same standard, which might have been true, I don't know. But what he said next almost certainly wasn't true. He claimed he couldn't change the scene because it had actually happened, which would be relevant if he were writing a biography, but this is fiction. None of it actually happened. It doesn't matter if what you're basing it on did actually happen. Deseret Books removed the book from the catalog, didn't stock it in stores, and even refused to let Chad sign copies of it at a Deseret Books signing event, which just practically I don't know how they would have accomplished. I guarantee he lost money because of this decision not to change the scene, and not a little money. We're talking thousands of dollars. This was basically the equivalent of the Mormon Amazon bookstore refusing to carry the book. At the time Chasing Paradise was published, Chad was the managing editor at Cedar Fort Publishing. Why they thought he was qualified for such a position, I don't know. Cedar Fort also published Chasing Paradise, so he wasn't just screwing himself over when he refused to change the book. He was screwing over his boss, too. Chad's autobiography gives a weird explanation of what happened here. By early 2004, I had been on the publishing treadmill at Cedar Fort for 3 years. We continued to produce great books, and I loved working with Lee and Georgia, but I needed a mental break, and I didn't see one in sight. We were releasing so many titles each month that it felt like I had more deadlines to meet than I'd had working at the Standard Examiner. One evening I left the office late, feeling like I was finally getting caught up. Then I returned in the morning, and Lee had put several more accepted manuscripts on my chair. I just kind of snapped. I went home and told Tammy I'd had enough. She certainly understood. I wrote a resignation letter and put it on the owner's desk. Yeah, I'm sure Tammy totally understood. An author usually gets about 10% of the cover price of a traditionally published book. The other 90% goes to the publisher because they're making the financial investment. By the time Deseret Books pulled Chasing Paradise from their advertising catalog, Cedar Fort had quite possibly already paid for this book to be printed. And then Chad ruined its sales potential. So however much money Chad lost, Cedar Fort lost 9 times that, plus their investment. I have no evidence of this. This theory is pure speculation, but I think they fired him. I think that's why he claims to have just up and quit one day. Yeah, I just got burned out. I quit. Tammy was fine with it. I think they fired him. And furthermore, I think he started his own publishing company less than a year later to get back at Lee Nelson and at Cedar Fort. That, and so that he was in complete control of the publishing of his own books. Because Chad loves control just as much as he hates hippies. This is a watershed moment in Chad's life as an author. I don't know if a legit LDS publisher would have published the books he wrote after this, partly because they probably heard how he screwed Cedar Fort over, and I imagine the LDS publishing world is pretty tight. But by starting his own publishing company, Chad gave himself permission to publish anything he wanted, and he freed himself from any real oversight regarding whether or not what he was publishing was doctrinally sound. I find it unlikely that he wouldn't have gotten significant pushback if he had tried to publish the Standing in Holy Places series with an LDS publisher. they possibly would have just outright rejected it. Instead, he opened Spring Creek, and he set himself up so that the only person he had to answer to was probably Tammy. And as lovely a person as she seems to have been, she believed in Chad's gifts, and she believed he could predict the future. And because he had no real oversight and no pushback, his next series got real weird. Now back to the story. Kim gets baptized. Grandma Lucille and Grandpa Samuel attend the baptism. Nicole makes a little speech before the baptism. In the Book of Mormon, the prophet Nephi compares baptism to a gate leading to heaven. Picture in your mind that Heavenly Father lives in a beautiful white home that is surrounded by a tall white fence. The fence has only one opening, a sparkling gate that lets us enter the path to the home. If we never enter the gate, we won't be able to live with our Heavenly Father. But today, Kim is entering that gate, and as she keeps the commandments and stays on the right path, at the end of her life, she will find herself at the door to that beautiful white home, and Heavenly Father will welcome her in. Again, with the mansion. Again, with the whiteness. Again, a focus on the physical to the total exclusion of the emotional and spiritual experience. What is it like to be in the presence of God? Isn't that more important than what God's house looks like? Elder Brown baptizes Kim. The two of them like each other, which Chad tells us instead of showing us. Then one of the church elders bestows a blessing on Kim, and Grandpa Samuel whispers in his ear, which influences him to say that Kim has a special spiritual mission to be the bridge between the living and the dead. He even magically knows Tina's name. Thus ends chapter 22. Carmen is convinced by the blessing that Tina wants to be baptized, and Frank tells her to do what she wants, because he's lost interest or something. I don't know. So Carmen tells Kim she can have Tina baptized. Tina is happy until she finds out she has to have been dead for a year before she can get proxy baptized. Then Lucille shows up and tells Tina that she has a new job to perform in spirit prison, and her mission on Earth is over, and they leave. It's very abrupt. Thus ends chapter 23. The Marlar family council has asked Tina to live among her Peruvian ancestors in spirit prison and teach them the gospel. Lucille introduces them to Tina, and they immediately say, yes, teach us your religion. I don't know if Chad didn't realize that indigenous Peruvians have their own spiritual beliefs, or if this is another case of someone instantly recognizing the gospel is true. Either way, it kind of feels like an attempt to give Tina something to do while the book focuses on Kim for the next 40 pages. There is a serious pacing problem here in the second act. Thus ends chapter 24. The Air Force announces it's transferring Frank to Nebraska, less than a year after it transferred him to Utah. So, yeah. Kim doesn't want to go live there because she's a senior and only has a few months of school left, so she arranges to live with Nicole until graduation. Then she signs up to receive a patriarchal blessing, which is a special blessing that you can receive in an LDS church. If you've heard that incredibly long blessing Chad gave Alex Cox a couple of weeks before Alex mysteriously died, you've heard a patriarchal blessing. Thus ends chapter 25. Kim receives her patriarchal blessing, which says that she has a special mission in life to bring her parents into the church. She starts to think that maybe she should go with them to Nebraska, and she and Nicole pray about it and decide she should go. Thus ends chapter 26. It's at this point that the book starts to feel like it's lost all direction. Our main character, Tina, is nowhere to be found for chapters on end, and all this stuff with Kim feels like filler to pass the time until Tina can get baptized. So Kim exchanges an awkward goodbye handshake with Elder Brown before moving to Nebraska. Frank, meanwhile, has inexplicably come to really like Elder Brown and tells him to visit any time. I have no idea what happened to make Frank like Elder Brown. He just does now. Over and over, Frank does things and we never see why. Thus ends chapter 27. Kim spends the next 2 months in Nebraska, finishes high school, and becomes a stay-at-home daughter. Then Elder Brown comes to visit on his way to the East Coast, but he's finished his mission, so everyone just calls him Josh now. He plays Trivial Pursuit with Kim and her family and sleeps on their couch and then leaves. Thus ends chapter 28. 5 days later, Josh is back. He made it to New Jersey and hated it, surprise, surprise, and left after one day. He and Kim confess their undying love and get engaged, and he decides to go to college at Kansas State so that he and Kim can be close to her parents, whom she's still trying to nudge into the church. That ends chapter 29. The Marlars travel to California to meet Josh's family, including his sister Becky. Becky doesn't come across well in her conversation with Kim about men. Before I went on my mission, I was basically dating 2 guys at the same time, Becky said. That doesn't sound like a problem, or a surprise, Kim said. You're beautiful. I'm sure you had lots of guys after you. Becky shrugged off the compliment. I went on my mission for the right reasons, but I also went in hopes that one of them would get married while I was gone. Unfortunately, they're both still single, and both eager to see me. What kind of passive BS is this? Make a decision, Becky. Then it becomes clear what the real problem is when Becky says, but Doug wants to become a writer, and I don't know many rich authors. But it gets worse. Apparently she's been staying with Chris because she thinks he'll make a lot of money, even though he treats her like crap. There really isn't comparison between the two. Chris isn't much of a gentleman. In fact, he treats me kind of like a slave. I certainly feel better about myself when I'm around Doug. He has a calm maturity, and he treats me so well. Doug does not have a calm maturity. I think the cave date scene made that quite clear. I think him abandoning his own great-grandpa to the Yahtzees made that painfully clear. But maybe Becky doesn't know about that because not telling a girl that you became friends with her grandpa while time traveling is a great foundation for a strong relationship. Becky then justifies her desire for wealth. I guess after being so poor on the Canary Islands for 18 months, I've let the big salary Chris receives play a larger role in my decision than it should. The poverty in the islands was depressing, and I vowed to marry a rich guy. What I think is so interesting about this is that seeing poverty didn't make her want to help people. It didn't make her a crusader for others. No, her reaction is, I don't ever want to have to live like those people. It's completely self-centered. But by the end of the discussion, she's decided to marry Doug. Also weird dig against the Canaries. Thus ends chapter 30. Finally, we get back to Tina, who's been in a remote part of Spirit Prison teaching her Peruvian ancestors the gospel. It isn't completely clear how long she's been out there, but I did the math, and it can't have been longer than 6 months. Listen to how much success she's had in that time. This group was very receptive to the gospel message, just like the dozens of other groups Tina had taught. She estimated 25,000 spirits had accepted the gospel. 25,000 people? Rough math. She's converted 10 people a second for 6 months. This is such a fantasy of Chad's. He makes such a big deal about how many baptisms people get. Obviously, he's dissatisfied with his own performance as a missionary. Kim starts her wedding day by getting proxy baptized for Tina, who is very happy, and attends Kim and Josh's wedding along with several other Spirit family members. Carmen is disappointed that she and Frank aren't allowed to attend the ceremony because they aren't members of the church, so they can't enter the temple. Carmen prods Frank about the two of them one day becoming members, and he gets cranky, which Chad describes as his anti-Mormon feelings flaring up. Like they're a case of gout he's afflicted with and not a reflection of his profound insecurity. Thus ends chapter 31. Tina is finally allowed to join her family in paradise. She and Grandma Lucille fly over Spirit Prison and past the angel warriors who guard paradise until they finally reach the most beautiful home Tina had ever seen. Who lives here? She asked. We do. But Grandma Lucille reassures Tina that she only has to stay with her grandparents temporarily, just until her own mansion is built. Which I guess is going to take time, because for some reason God can't just wave his hand and make a mansion. Tina encounters something unexpected in her grandparents' mansion. She was surprised when a large dog leaped out from under a bush. Grandma, there's a dog in here, Tina called out. She turned back to the dog, who shocked her by saying, I won't hurt you. My name is Zipper. If I'm approached by a strange dog, my first instinct is to speak to it in a calm, friendly tone. I thought it was peculiar that Tina instead alerted Lucille to the existence of the dog. Does she think it wandered in off the street? Are there strays in paradise? Grandma Lucille explains the presence of the dog. Animals have spirits too, and they have their own section of the spirit world. But spirits in paradise can request to have their pets come live with them. If the animal agrees, everything works out just fine. And if the animal doesn't agree, it'll turn on its owner. Am I the only one who heard some kind of weird implication here? I did find a reference to animal spirits in Life Everlasting. It is of interest to note that the inhabitants of celestial glory will be privileged to enjoy not only the companionship of man, but also that of the resurrected animal kingdom. Benjamin F. Johnson, an early companion of Joseph Smith, wrote that the latter taught that all the animal kingdoms would be resurrected, and made us to understand that they would remain in the dominion of those who, with creative power, reach out for dominion through the power of eternal lives. I didn't quite understand that last part, but, okay. This idea of animal spirits, and especially of them talking, raises so many practical questions that never get addressed. Like, was Zipper always sentient and just unable to speak when he was on Earth? Or did he develop sentience in paradise? Do pets have to belong to Mormons to get to paradise? Which is kind of what it sounds like. Then there's an example of just terrible writing. I'm glad to finally meet you, Zipper said. Everyone is so happy you are here. Then he trotted back under the bush. Tina smiled. Zipper seems to be quite a character. You can't just say someone's quite a character. That expression has a meaning, and it doesn't apply here. Zipper is the least interesting talking animal I've ever encountered in fiction. I'm not sure if Chad doesn't know what quite a character means as an expression, or if he thinks it's just something people say. Finally, Grandma Lucille takes Tina to see another part of paradise. A mountain seemingly made of diamonds towered above them, and a majestic golden city lay below, ringed by a fiery fence. This is where the Savior lives when he visits paradise, Lucille said. They aren't allowed to go there, and there's no explanation of where Jesus lives the rest of the time. As I said earlier, he's apparently functioning as the son in spirit prison, so... But the interesting thing about this description is the emphasis on riches. There's an entire mountain made of diamonds. The whole city is gold. As with the mansions, Chad associates spiritual wealth with the trappings of material wealth, despite repeatedly claiming that material wealth is meaningless in the afterlife. He's undermining his own message. Thus ends chapter 32. This book is falling apart. I take such good care of my books, but Chad's books they're like croissants, Like, no matter how careful you are, bits just keep coming off. Tina is recalled by the Marlar Family Council because they want her to go back to Earth and influence Kim to find Ida's birth records and proxy baptize her. Tina is glad to go back. Meanwhile, Kim is adjusting to married life and attending church. She attends a women's group meeting where they discuss family history work before turning into stereotyped caricatures. A heated discussion began about how men don't do anything around the house during football season. Welcome to the 50s, Kim. Kim has been instructed to fill out a 4-generation family tree and realizes she has no idea who any of her ancestors are, so she makes Josh drive her the 4 hours to her parents' house to ask their help with what could have easily been accomplished in a phone call. Carmen only knows the names of her own parents, and Frank claims not to know the name of his own parents or to have a copy of his birth certificate, which I feel like would have been a problem when he tried to join the Air Force. But maybe I'm wrong. Kim blows off work to go to the library and Google her father, because Chad didn't know about home internet in 2003, and she has no trouble finding her entire genealogical record. When she finds out her grandparents lived and died in Utah, she immediately assumes they must have been Mormon, and she gets all excited. She decides to skip work again the next day and drive to a town 3 hours away in Kansas, where several generations of her ancestors used to live. Why? No one knows. At the cemetery, she discovers Ida's headstone, but she can't make out the name on it. A clerk at the courthouse lets her look at the original records of everyone buried in the cemetery. They're all written on little cards, but Tina carefully looked at Henry Marlar's card. It was actually 2 cards stuck together. The second one had to be Ida's card. Without a second thought, Tina reached out to pull the cards apart, but in her haste, she accidentally pushed the whole stack off the table. Tina stood helplessly as Kim let out a soundless cry. Tina manages to knock Ida's card through a floor grate and into a vent. She should have learned her lesson after she distracted her father, but she didn't. The Marlar family council immediately sucks her back to paradise. Thus ends chapter 33. Chapter 34 begins with the Marlar family council permanently banning Tina from the mortal world. She then comes up with an absurd counter-proposal. I propose that Grandma Lucille be allowed to write a story about what has happened to me since my family moved to Utah. Maybe it would change my father's heart. I could write it myself, but Grandma would do a much better job. President Tanner was thoughtful. What would you do with the story once it was written? Tina grew a bit bolder. We could somehow transport it to the mortal world and let someone find it who can get it into my family's hands. Tina glanced back at Lucille, who seemed to like the idea. What? And the council agrees. They have just banned Tina from the mortal world for knocking some cards off a table, but they have no problem with dead people writing books and publishing them on Earth. What kind of reasoning is that? Chad loves to describe how orderly and organized the spirit world is and how Jesus has everything running on a timetable, but there can't be order without consistency. If the rules don't make any sense and they aren't consistently applied, that's not order. The president of the family council agrees. I have an old acquaintance in Provo named Guy Calvert. He's a good man, and he has the ability to get it published. Plus, he will soon be called to serve a mission in Kansas and could get the book into Kim's hands. Why don't you just drop it off on Kim's doorstep? What do we even need Guy Calvert for? I mean, if there aren't any rules, do whatever you want. I'm not sure why he chose Guy Calvert, who's a contractor and doesn't have anything to do with the publishing world. He then gives Grandma Lucille a piece of advice, and I have a theory about it. My theory is that Chad added this after getting negative feedback on the first draft of this novel. Listen to this. One word of caution. I'm sure your family members on Earth would love a flowery description of the spirit world, but please keep that to a minimum. The key is helping Frank and Carmen see the truth, rather than giving them a tour of the spirit world. So Chad didn't want to write setting descriptions, because he never does. And people thought it was strange that he kept talking about how beautiful paradise was, but never actually described it, other than the mansions. And he included this to justify his choice. Thus ends chapter 34. The next part of the book doesn't have a chapter number. It just says, a message from Tina. Look, the pages are falling out. At this point, we're meant to understand that we've just read the book that Lucille wrote. And what we're reading now is a 2-page addendum that Tina wrote, which is basically a letter telling Kim that she's awesome and to go find Ida's birth records, and telling Frank and Carmen to shape up and join the church. Here's how Tina ends her letter. There are so many beautiful things about the spirit world that Grandma and I weren't allowed to share, but I hope we can all live together someday here in paradise. My mansion is under construction, and it will have plenty of extra rooms. I'm hoping you will each stay with me until your own mansions are built. I have never in my life read a fiction book where the author tried to work excuses for their poor writing into the text like this. I've complained before that Chad will point out weak plot elements when he shouldn't. Now he's pointing out weak textual elements. The next section doesn't even have a heading. It's just a note from the fictional publisher saying that they received another letter and were asked to stick it in at the end of the manuscript when it went to print. This letter is from Kim, and it describes how she was contacted by Guy Calvert and given a copy of the galley proofs of the book, which she instantly concluded was true. So she copied it and mailed it to her mother, who read it and instantly knew it was true. She made Frank read it, but after a few pages, he decided the most likely explanation for the book's existence was that Guy Calvert had written it to manipulate Carmen into joining the church. It's an unbelievably paranoid theory. Frank demands that Guy Calvert and his wife visit so he can interrogate them about the book. Rather than pointing out that Guy Calvert doesn't even know the Marlars, he lives in another state, and he would have had to have spied on them quite intimately for more than a year in order to write this manuscript, Guy says he can't write a book because he's a contractor. You'd think a cemetery sexton turned author would realize that manual labor and intellectual pursuits aren't mutually exclusive, but Chad is not actually an intellectual. Guy's wife offers to start teaching Carmen the gospel right then, and Frank flies off the handle and says he's going to stay in a hotel. Before he leaves, Guy gives him the original handwritten manuscript for the book. We then get something I've never seen before. An epistle within an epistle. Kim pauses in her letter to include a written account from Frank about what happened to him at the hotel. Here's how she introduces it. Dad did eventually return a few hours later, worn out and humbled. He told us a marvelous experience. I had him write it down for me for our family history, and here's what he wrote. Okay. Frank describes how he got a room at the Best Western and then did some thinking. Those of you watching the trial may have noticed several references to Best Western. It seems to be Chad's favorite hotel chain. Mine's Red Roof. Frank says this about the thinking he did at the Best Western. I thought back to my conversation with the Calverts. They had seemed completely sincere. What if this whole story were true? I pulled the hair on my head in agony, because if it were true, that would mean I had been wrong all these years. This is so telling. What Frank is really upset about is the fact he might have been wrong. It's all about his pride and the vital importance of being right. He ends up reading the manuscript. Even though he recognizes immediately that it's in his mother's handwriting, the thing that really convinces him it's authentic is the appearance of Zipper the talking dog. He has a change of heart and realizes he never should have left the church, and he goes home and apologizes to his family. Thus ends Frank's epistle. Back to Kim's epistle. She says her mother got baptized immediately, and her father began the process of rejoining the church. Then she writes, Dad has suffered much anguish over his past behavior, and the hardest thing of all might be forgiving himself, because he feels Tina might still be alive if he had stayed true to the faith. How did Frank leaving the church have anything to do with his daughter being randomly hit by a distracted driver 20 years later? The only explanation I can come up with for this is that Frank feels God killed Tina for the express purpose of bringing him back to the church. Previously, I've talked about Chad's abnormal view of children. This takes it up a notch. Now God is justified in killing children in order to teach their parents a lesson. 2 days ago, during Chad's trial, the prosecution played audio that seemed to imply, allegedly, that members of Chad's cult expected 2 of Melanie Pulowski's children to soon be dead. Children she shared with Brandon Boudreau, whom she allegedly had Alex try to kill. So my purely speculative question is, did Chad tell her that God would see the deaths of her children as justified if they were killed to teach Brandon a lesson? Maybe my imagination has gotten away with me here. Maybe not. It's hard to say. Those people were capable of anything. Kim's epistle also says she's about to take care of Ida's temple work, so that's squared away, and that she and her parents are going to Peru to start converting her mother's family. So all is right with the world, except that Tina's still dead. Thus ends Chasing Paradise. Before I sign off, let's talk a bit about how this book could have been improved and what we've learned about Chad by reading it. Regarding how to fix the book, I actually think this is the story of Chad's with the most potential for improvement. It has a plot and subplots, and they actually span the entire book. There aren't 50 pages of denouement for once. That said, the pacing is incredibly uneven. The middle section about Kim and Josh drags on, and if I were editing this, I would tell Chad that he simply can't have 6 chapters in a row where the main character doesn't appear. If he wants to put Kim in a main character role and kind of alternate between him and Tina, that's fine, but he has to start that early on. There's no reason it all needs to be told from Tina's point of view, but if we come to expect the change off between narrators, it won't feel like there's this huge gap in the middle where Tina vanishes. Ideally, Kim and Tina's plotlines would peak at the same time. Writing fiction is essentially an exercise in developing, sustaining, and releasing tension. That's something Chad's plotting consistently fails to do, but this story is as close to success as he ever comes. The characters' positions and conflicts also need to be more clearly established and then described consistently. We never find out why Frank hates Mormons. Because he used to be one isn't sufficient. I grew up Catholic, but I don't hate Catholics. I think Chad could have improved this book by deciding what happened that caused Frank to leave the church and why he turned on it the way he did. That would have given some explanation for why he doesn't want Kim to join and some basis for his behavior and their conflict. It would also make Frank much more interesting and much more complex as a character. Unfortunately, because Chad believes that no Mormon can ever do anything wrong, and because Frank is going to reconvert in the future, he can't even give Frank a sufficiently sinful past. As for Chad's refusal to write adequate scene descriptions, he needs to get over it. Scene descriptions are fundamental to fiction. Are there writers who are talented and clever enough not to need them? There probably are, although I can't think of one. I'm sure someone out there has found a way to make fiction work without writing scene descriptions. But Chad isn't talented enough to achieve that feat, and he isn't disciplined enough to make himself write scene descriptions. I don't love writing scene descriptions either. Frankly, they stress me out. But you know what? That's the job. Describing things is the job. Now, regarding what we've learned about Chad himself. Well, the scene description thing and the no flowery descriptions of paradise thing tell us a lot about Chad. They tell us that he lacks discipline, that he doesn't care what his readers want, and that he's defensive about not caring what his readers want. He would rather write what he wants than concern himself with his readers' experience, and that's not necessarily a criticism. There's nothing wrong with writing for yourself, writing just what you want. But you can't ignore your readers' experience and then be mad when they don't like your writing. Chad's materialism is quite apparent in this story. As we know, money played a huge part in the crimes of which he's been accused. His trial on multiple counts of grand theft and insurance fraud is taking place as I record this. Chad's obsession with being right started to appear in Escape to Zion, and it only gets more intense in this book. It's going to reach a high point in his next novel, The Great Gathering, but it will remain an important theme in his next 9 books. In my experience, people who are this desperate to be right are usually deeply, deeply insecure. And this dovetails perfectly with Chad's narcissism. A lot of people don't realize this, but narcissism is rooted in insecurity. Narcissists feel so bad about themselves that they mentally reject the possibility that they have any flaws at all. The more invested they become in this false, perfect persona, the more devastating they find criticism because they feel like that self-image is all they have. And the more they double down on whatever it is they're claiming to be. We can actually see Chad doing this in the Deseret News article about the controversy regarding this book. He's told that a scene is inappropriate, and instead of considering that maybe it is, he declares that not only is it appropriate, it actually happened, which is pretty much just another way of saying he's right. Then, like all narcissists are wont to do, he declares himself the victim in the situation. I would like to end with an excerpt from Return from Tomorrow. This is from the scene I read earlier, when George is watching the spirits who are stuck in their anger and rage fight each other on the plane. the scene Chad ripped off. This is how the rest of it goes. Gradually, I was becoming aware that there was something else on the plane of grappling forms. Almost from the beginning, I had sensed it, but for a long time I could not locate it. When I did, it was with a shock that left me stunned. That entire unhappy plane was hovered over by beings seemingly made of light. It was their very size and blinding brightness that had prevented me at first from seeing them. Now that I adjusted my eyes to take them in, I could see their immense presences were bending over the little creatures on the plane, perhaps even conversing with them. Were these bright beings angels? Was the light beside me also an angel? But the thought that had pressed itself so undeniably on my mind in that little hospital room had been, "You are in the presence of the Son of God." Could it be that each of these other human wraiths, wretched and unworthy like me, was also in his presence? In a realm where space and time no longer followed any rules I knew, could he be standing with each one of them as he was with me? I did not know. All I clearly saw was that not one of these bickering beings on the plane had been abandoned. They were being attended, watched over, ministered to. And the equally observable fact was that not one of them knew it. If Jesus or his angels were speaking to them, they certainly did not hear. There was no pause in the stream of rancor coming from their own hearts. Their eyes sought only some nearby figure to humiliate. It would have seemed to me impossible not to be aware of what were the hugest and most striking features of that whole landscape, except that I myself had stared at them unseeing. In fact, now that I had become aware of these bright presences, I realized with bewilderment that I had been seeing them all along, without ever consciously registering the fact, as though Jesus could show me at any moment only so much as I was ready to see. Angels had crowded the living cities and towns we had visited. They had been present in the streets, the factories, the homes, even in that raucous bar, where nobody had been any more conscious of their existence than I myself had. And suddenly I realized that there was a common denominator to all these scenes so far. It was the failure to see Jesus. Whether it was a physical appetite, an earthly concern, an absorption with self, whatever got in the way of his light created the separation into which we stepped at death. Chad read this book. He ripped it off, but he failed to understand it. Just like the angry spirits he dismissed, the ones who were fighting because they so desperately needed to be right, Chad failed to see Jesus, standing patiently beside him, waiting for him to look up. And that is very, very sad to me. In my next video, I'll be discussing Chad's fifth novel, The Great Gathering, which is the first book in his 5-part series, Standing in Holy Places. Honestly, I hated every word of this series, and I had to make some pretty goofy art to get through it, which I will share with you. Emma becomes just unbearable as soon as the series starts, and by the end I outright loathed her. As a reminder, please don't contact or harass anyone involved in this case. If you'd like to watch more literary criticism on the work of Chad Daybell, please consider liking or subscribing. And remember, use your words wisely. Thanks.